Everyone laughed at her marriage, until the Vampire King showed his true power. Lyra stood at the edge of the grand hall, her heart pounding in her chest as she gazed at the crowd of nobles, the whispers of laughter echoing through the stone walls. The weight of her long silk gown felt heavier than ever, dragging her down as she stood there, waiting for the moment that would define the rest of her life. The gilded doors of the chapel loomed before her, and she could hear the murmur of the guests, laughter, idle chatter, and whispers that only deepened her sense of dread. The truth was that no one believed in the love between Lyra and Lord Vincent. They saw her marriage as nothing more than a political agreement, a means for the two noble families to solidify their power. The marriage had been arranged when she was little, a promise made to bring prosperity to her family and stability to the kingdom. But none of that mattered to Lyra. She didn't care about power. She didn't care about titles or land. All she had ever wanted was love, a love she could never have. Lord Vincent, with his graying hair and stiff, disinterested manner, was nothing like the man she had once dreamed of. He was older than her father, a man whose eyes were always focused on the wealth and status he could gain from the union. To him, Lyra was merely another possession, a piece of the political puzzle. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the delicate bouquet of roses, their sweet scent doing little to calm her nerves. The laughter from the crowd grew louder as she stepped forward, her heels clicking on the marble floors. They were laughing at her, Lyra knew that much. They didn't believe she had a choice in the matter. They saw her as trapped, as nothing more than a pawn in her family's game. As Lyra walked down the aisle, her heart grew heavier with each step. Her mind raced with the thought of escaping, running away from the life that had been forced upon her. But where could she go? What could she do? The weight of the crown, the responsibilities that came with it were too great. There was no escaping her fate. Lord Vincent stood at the altar, his hands folded before him, his gaze fixed on the guests. He didn't even look at her as she approached, his attention entirely on the power and influence this marriage would bring. Lyra's heart sank. She had never been in love with him, and she never would be. But as she stood before him, ready to make the vows that would bind her to him forever, something unexpected happened. A shadow fell across the hall, and Lyra felt it long before she saw it. A chill swept through the air, and the murmur of the crowd faded to an uneasy silence. Lyra's gaze shifted to the door, and for a moment she wondered if she had imagined it. The doors to the chapel slammed open with a resounding force, causing everyone to turn their heads. The room fell deathly silent as a tall figure entered, draped in a cloak as dark as midnight. His presence was undeniable, a palpable force that seemed to command the very air around him. The man was unlike any she had ever seen. His pale skin gleamed in the dim light, his eyes glowing like two pools of liquid gold, and his dark hair fell like a waterfall around his face. The crowd gasped, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. Lyra's heart skipped a beat, though she didn't know why. The Vampire King. Lyra had heard of him only in hushed whispers, a figure of legend and fear in the kingdom. The story spoke of his power, of his dark rule over the land, and of the curse that bound him. No one had seen him in years, and yet here he was, standing before her, a being of such raw power that the very earth seemed to tremble beneath his feet. He stepped into the chapel, his gaze locking onto Lyra with a fierce intensity that made her blood run cold. For a moment everything seemed to stop. Time, the world, the very breath in her lungs. Lyra couldn't look away. The Vampire King's presence was overwhelming, like the weight of centuries pressing down on her soul. He was real, not a myth or a legend. "Your Majesty," Lord Vincent stammered, his voice unsteady as he tried to step forward, his hand shaking. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" The Vampire King did not answer at first. His gaze never left Lyra. Slowly he took a step forward, his movements fluid, almost unnatural in their grace. As he approached the altar, the crowd parted, their fear palpable. It was clear they recognized him for who he was, a creature of unimaginable power. The silence in the chapel grew thick, suffocating. Lyra's heart raced in her chest as the Vampire King stopped in front of her. His eyes gleamed as he studied her, as if he could see into the very depths of her soul. There was something about him, something that drew her in, something that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into an unknown abyss. Finally, the Vampire King spoke, his voice a deep melodic growl that seemed to reverberate through the air. "You do not belong here," he said, his words both a statement and a command. "This marriage, it is a mockery of what you deserve." Lyra blinked, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't understand what he meant, but the force of his words rattled her. The Vampire King's eyes flicked briefly to Lord Vincent, who was now frozen in place, his face pale and full of fear. "This marriage," the Vampire King continued, his gaze still fixed on Lyra, "is a prison, a cage. And you, my lady, are not meant to be caged." The crowd held their breath as the tension in the room mounted. Lyra could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. What was he saying? What was happening? The Vampire King took another step closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You are mine," he said, and his words echoed in Lyra's mind, sending a shiver down her spine. Lord Vincent took a step back, his voice trembling. "You cannot take her! She is betrothed to me!"
"I have the right to marry her." The Vampire King's gaze shifted briefly to Lord Vincent, his eyes narrowing with disdain.
Without a word, he raised one hand, and the air itself seemed to bend under the force of his power. Lord Vincent's voice faltered, and he fell silent, unable to speak or move. The room was filled with a heavy, oppressive silence as the Vampire King turned his attention back to Lyra. "You have no choice in the matter, little noblewoman," he said softly. "You will come with me, and together we will leave this place behind." Lyra stood frozen, her mind spinning. She had heard the rumors, the legends. She had never believed them. But now, standing before this man, this creature, Lyra felt a strange sense of inevitability. There was something about him that called to her, something that made her want to flee, and yet, at the same time, something that made her want to stay. Her gaze met the Vampire King's, and in that moment, she knew. Her life would never be the same again. Lyra stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as the Vampire King's hand reached out towards her. His touch seemed to carry a weight, a strange, invisible pull that made her entire body tense. His fingers were cold, and yet the chill sent a rush of warmth through her, as though her very soul were awakening to a new, unfamiliar feeling. For a moment there was no sound. The entire room, once filled with laughter and whispers, was now utterly silent, save for the thudding of Lyra's own heartbeat. She could feel the eyes of every noble, every servant, every soul in the room, watching her every move, waiting for her decision. The Vampire King's gaze never wavered, his golden eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. She had heard the stories, of course, the myths that spoke of him as a dark and terrifying ruler, a creature of the night who had once controlled entire kingdoms. But now, as she stood before him, she realized that the stories were not just tales told to children. He was real, and so was the power that radiated from him. "You have no choice," he whispered again, his voice like silk, but with an undeniable force behind it. "You are mine now, and I will not let you slip away." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The words rang in her mind, spinning like a whirlwind. She wanted to run, to escape from this moment, to retreat back into the life she had known before everything changed. But something within her, something deep and inexplicable, told her that there was no turning back now. She glanced around the room, her eyes briefly meeting those of Lord Vincent, who stood trembling in the background, completely powerless. His once confident demeanor was shattered, replaced by an expression of fear that made Lyra's stomach churn with discomfort. He had been her fiancé, the man she was supposed to marry, but in this moment he seemed so small, so insignificant compared to the overwhelming presence of the Vampire King. With a trembling hand, Lyra reached out, allowing the cold fingers of the Vampire King to brush against her skin. The touch was electric, sending a shudder through her body that she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear. It wasn't revulsion. It was something else. Something that made her feel alive in a way she had never felt before. "Come with me," the Vampire King commanded softly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. There was no question in his tone, no doubt. It was a statement, and it left no room for resistance. Lyra swallowed, her throat dry. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the pressure building with every passing second. What was she supposed to do? What choice did she have? The future she had once imagined for herself, the life of a dutiful wife, trapped in a marriage that meant nothing, now seemed like a distant dream. This was reality, and reality was more terrifying and more thrilling than she could have ever imagined. Slowly she nodded, barely able to hear her own voice as she spoke. "I will go with you." The Vampire King's lips curled into a smile, a subtle but undeniable expression of triumph. He released her hand, turning to face the room, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in it. "The wedding is over," he announced, his voice echoing through the vast hall. "This woman, Lyra, is no longer bound by your petty contracts or promises. She is free, and I am taking her with me." The nobles in the room began to murmur, their voices rising in a chorus of disbelief and confusion. Some of them looked at Lyra with pity, others with anger, but none of them dared to challenge the Vampire King. The power he wielded was too great, and they knew better than to oppose him. Lyra's heart raced as she followed him through the hall, her feet barely touching the ground. Every step she took seemed to carry her farther away from the life she had known, and yet she couldn't bring herself to feel regret. There was something magnetic about the Vampire King, something that made her feel as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, about to leap into the unknown. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. As they reached the doors, the Vampire King paused and turned back to face the room. "You are all dismissed," he said coldly, his eyes scanning the crowd one last time. "This kingdom belongs to me now." Without waiting for a response, he pushed the doors open and stepped into the night, with Lyra at his side. The cool night air hit Lyra like a wave as she stepped outside, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the empty streets. The world outside the chapel was still, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt like a dream, as though the entire world had shifted beneath her feet, and she was now living in someone else's reality. The Vampire King led her through the darkened streets, his presence like a shadow that swallowed the light. He moved with a grace that was almost unnatural, his long cloak billowing behind him like the wings of a dark angel. Lyra couldn't help but stare at him, captivated by the power that radiated from him. She had never been so close to someone like him, so close to something so dangerous. "We are leaving this kingdom behind," he said, his voice low and steady. "You will be safe with me. No one will dare to harm you." Lyra couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt at the thought of leaving everything behind, the family, the friends, the life she had always known. But at the same time she felt something else, a pull, a desire, a longing for something more than the small, confined life she had been living. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King glanced at her, his golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. "What I want is simple," he replied. "You, your power, and your freedom." Lyra furrowed her brow, confusion clouding her mind. "My power? You are more than just a noble woman, Lyra," he said softly. "You have a strength within you that you have yet to realize. The curse that binds you is not just a family curse. It is your curse, and I will help you unlock it. Together we can break the chains that have held both of us captive for so long." Lyra's mind raced as she tried to understand his words. She had always felt different, but she had never imagined that there was more to her than what she had been taught. The life she had known had been a lie, a cage built around her, and now, for the first time, she was beginning to see the truth. They reached the outskirts of the kingdom, where a dark, imposing castle loomed in the distance, its silhouette outlined against the night sky. The Vampire King's home. "This is where you will stay," he said, his voice softening for the first time. "This is where you will learn the truth about who you are." Lyra stood in awe of the castle, its towering walls and sharp, pointed spires a stark contrast to the peaceful, quiet life she had once known. This was where her new life would begin. And although she had no idea what awaited her within its walls, she knew one thing for certain: her journey had only just begun. The air inside the Vampire King's castle was thick with the scent of ancient stone and faintly burning candles. Lyra stepped through the grand entrance, her heart still racing from the journey. The castle's walls seemed to loom over her, towering and imposing, yet oddly comforting in their solitude. This place felt like a world of its own, removed from everything she had known before. Her footsteps echoed through the grand hall, the marble floors gleaming in the dim light. The castle was beautiful, in a way that was both haunting and mesmerizing. The tapestries that hung on the walls depicted scenes of forgotten battles, of kings and queens long gone, and of landscapes that seemed to exist in a realm beyond her understanding. The Vampire King had not spoken much during the journey. He had led her through the darkened streets of the kingdom, without once looking back at the life she had left behind. His silence had been heavy, as though he was lost in his own thoughts. But now, as they walked deeper into the castle, something seemed to change. His presence, once overwhelming and intimidating, softened just slightly, as if he had allowed himself to let his guard down. Lyra turned to him as they reached a massive door at the end of the hall, its surface intricately carved with patterns she couldn't decipher. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know she was asking about the castle itself, or the strange unspoken connection that was growing between them. The Vampire King's gaze shifted toward her, his golden eyes reflecting a glimmer of something. Perhaps sadness, perhaps regret. "This is where you will begin to understand," he replied, his voice deep and steady, as though he had spoken these words many times before. "This castle has been my home for centuries. It is a place of power and knowledge, but also of secrets." He reached for the door, pushing it open with a quiet, effortless motion. The room beyond was vast, filled with shelves of ancient books and artifacts. The scent of dust hung in the air. But there was something else too. Something more alive, more vibrant. "This is the library," the Vampire King said, stepping inside. "And it is here that you will learn the truth about your past, your family, and the curse that binds us both." Lyra hesitated, unsure of what to say. She had never been one for books or learning in the traditional sense, but something in his words caught her attention. The promise of answers, of uncovering the truth, stirred something deep within her. As she crossed the threshold into the room, Lyra's gaze was drawn to a large wooden table in the center, covered with scrolls and maps. The Vampire King moved toward it, his fingers brushing over the edges of an old, tattered book. "Your family has a long history," he continued. "A history that has been hidden from you. But you are not just a noble woman, Lyra. You are the key to breaking the curse that has haunted our bloodlines for generations." Lyra frowned, confusion clouding her thoughts. "I don't understand," she said. "I'm just a noblewoman, a woman who was promised to Lord Vincent." "What do you mean I'm the key?" The Vampire King turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Your bloodline carries a unique power," he explained. "A power that was passed down to you through generations of rulers, hidden beneath the veil of time. That power is the key to breaking the curse that binds me, and the key to understanding your own fate." Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known she was different, but she had never imagined that she might possess some kind of power. She had always felt like a pawn in someone else's game, someone else's plans. But now the idea that she was somehow connected to the Vampire King, that she might hold the key to his curse, made her head spin. "I don't know if I can help you," Lyra said softly. "I don't even know who I am anymore." The Vampire King's gaze softened, just for a moment, and he walked toward her. "You are more than you realize," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The power that lies within you is not something that can be understood with mere words. It must be felt, experienced, and that is why you are here." He reached for a nearby scroll, unrolling it carefully across the table. "This is the map of the kingdom's history, the tale of our bloodlines and their connection to the ancient curse. Your family is part of this, whether you know it or not." Lyra leaned closer to the table, her curiosity growing. She had never seen anything like this map before. Its lines were intricate, winding like a spider's web. There were symbols and markings that seemed to shift as she looked at them. as though they were alive, moving with the passage of time. The curse was not always a curse, the Vampire King continued, his fingers tracing the map's edges. It was a pact made long ago between your ancestors and an ancient being, a being of great power, one who promised strength and protection in exchange for a soul. But as with all things tied to dark magic, the cost was too great. The price was a bloodline that would be forever cursed. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as she took in his words. "So it's my family's fault?" she asked, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "It's because of them that you're trapped?" The Vampire King looked at her, his expression somber. "No," he said quietly, "it is not your fault. But you are the key to breaking the chains that have bound me for centuries. The curse can only be undone by someone with the right bloodline, and that person is you." Lyra's mind raced. She had never imagined that her family's legacy was tied to something so dark, so dangerous. She had always thought her role was simple: to marry, to bear children, to live a quiet, respectable life. But now she was standing in a room with a Vampire King, learning that her very existence was tied to a centuries-old curse. "I don't know if I can do this," Lyra whispered. "I don't even understand it." The Vampire King's gaze softened, and for the first time since she had met him, he seemed vulnerable. "I understand your fear," he said, his voice low and soothing. "But you are not alone in this. We will break the curse together. You don't have to do it by yourself." For a long moment there was silence between them. Lyra stood there, absorbing his words, trying to understand the weight of what he was asking of her. Could she really be the one to change everything, to break a curse that had been in place for so long? She looked up at him, and for the first time she saw him not just as a ruler, a figure of power, but as someone who had suffered just as much as she had. He had been trapped in his own curse for centuries, and now he was offering her a chance to set them both free. "I'll help you," she said finally, her voice trembling with the weight of the decision. "I'll do whatever it takes." The Vampire King's eyes softened, and he nodded. "You are stronger than you know, Lyra. Together, we will find a way to end this curse. But first, we must unlock your power. We must learn what you are truly capable of." Lyra felt a surge of determination rise within her. She had come to this castle uncertain of her future, unsure of what path to take. But now, as she stood beside the Vampire King, she realized that this was her destiny: to break the curse, to uncover the truth about herself, and to face the challenges that lay ahead. Lyra stood before the Vampire King in the heart of his castle, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared herself for what was to come. The ancient stone walls of the room seemed to hum with energy, and the air was thick with anticipation. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This was the moment that would change everything. The Vampire King had been patient with her. Over the past few days, they had spent hours studying the ancient scrolls, unlocking pieces of the puzzle that had bound both their fates together. Lyra had learned more about the curse, about her family's bloodline, and about the dark pact that had been made long ago. But what she hadn't fully understood was how deeply she was connected to all of it, how her very existence held the key to breaking the curse that had trapped the Vampire King for centuries. But now she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. The room was silent, save for the quiet crackling of the fire on the hearth. The Vampire King stood across from her, his golden eyes fixed on her with a mixture of expectation and something else, perhaps longing, perhaps hope. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Lyra took a deep breath, her heart racing in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew that there was no turning back now. This was her destiny, the path she had been unwilling to see until now. She had come to this castle as a frightened, uncertain noblewoman, but she was not the same person anymore. She had discovered her power, and with it, her purpose. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with resolve. The Vampire King nodded, his eyes softening for a moment. He stepped forward, his presence enveloping her like a dark, comforting shadow. His hand brushed lightly against hers, sending a shiver through her. There was a warmth there, despite the coldness that radiated from him. "This will not be easy," he warned. "The curse is powerful, and its effects are not easily undone. But if you are truly willing to accept your role, then together, we can break it."
Lyra nodded, her mind focused on the task at hand.
She had seen the map of her family's bloodline, traced the patterns that bound her to the curse. The more she learned, the more she realized that the power within her was not just a gift, it was a responsibility. She had to use it, to wield it, or else the curse would never be broken. "I trust you," she said, her voice steady now, the uncertainty fading into determination. "I will do whatever it takes." The Vampire King's eyes locked with hers, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. For a moment it felt as though the entire world had fallen away, leaving only the two of them standing at the crossroads of destiny. There was no turning back, no second chance. What they did here would shape not only their fates, but the fate of the kingdom itself. "You will need to accept the crown," the Vampire King said softly, gesturing to a table beside them. Upon it sat a dark, ancient crown, its intricate design glimmering with a faint, otherworldly light. "It is the source of the curse, and it is also the key to breaking it. Only by wearing it can you unlock your full power." Lyra's breath caught in her throat as she gazed at the crown. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was something about it that made her heart race. She could feel its power, its weight, even from where she stood. The curse was tied to it, and yet she knew that this was the moment she had to embrace it. To wear the crown, to accept her role, was the only way to free herself and the Vampire King from the chains of the past. Without another word, the Vampire King picked up the crown and held it out to her. Lyra stepped forward, her hand shaking ever so slightly as she took it from him. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, a jolt of energy shot through her, making her gasp. The power of the crown surged through her, awakening something deep within her that she hadn't known was there. For a moment, the room spun around her, and she felt as though she were falling into darkness. The energy within her was overwhelming, threatening to consume her. She could feel the weight of centuries of history, of bloodlines, of curses, pressing down on her. And yet, at the same time, she felt a strange sense of freedom. This was who she was meant to be. This was her purpose. With a deep breath, she placed the crown upon her head. The room seemed to shift around her, the walls fading into nothingness as she was consumed by the power of the curse. She felt herself stretching, expanding, as though the very fabric of her being was being torn apart and remade. In that moment, she understood everything. She understood the curse, the bloodline, the pact made so many centuries ago. She understood the Vampire King's pain, his longing for freedom, for redemption. And she understood her own role in all of it. She was not just a noblewoman. She was the key to breaking the curse. She was the one who could set them both free. The crown on her head began to glow with an ethereal light, and she felt the power coursing through her veins. It was overwhelming, but it was also beautiful. She could feel the weight of it, but at the same time she felt lighter than she had ever felt before. It was as though the crown had unlocked something deep inside her, something that had been buried for far too long. The Vampire King stepped closer, his golden eyes watching her with awe and something else. Gratitude, perhaps. "You have done it," he said softly, his voice filled with wonder. "You have unlocked your true power, and with it, you have broken the curse." Lyra looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. She had done it. She had embraced her destiny, and together they had broken the chains that had bound them for so long. The curse was no more, and in its place something new had emerged, something more powerful than either of them had imagined. But there was still one more thing to be done. "Now," Lyra said, her voice strong and clear, "we rebuild." The Vampire King nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Together," he agreed. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the world lifting from their shoulders as they shared in the quiet victory. The curse was broken, the past had been shattered, and now they had a future to build. A future free from the chains of the past, free from the weight of the curse that had defined them both for so long.